What's the worst thing your daughter ever told you? My angelic 9-year-old daughter Malia took a pair of scissors to her sister's hand-sewn wedding dress. I woke up to Lee sobbing in her room, holding the remains of the dress she'd dreamed of wearing on. She'd spent the last 6 months designing and sewing it herself, covering it in hand-sewn crystals, planning to launch her own bridal design business after the wedding. Malia was sitting on her own bed when I found her, the fabric scissors still on her desk. "Did you do this?" I asked, unable to believe it. She nodded but wouldn't say why. My girls adored each other despite the age gap, and Malia had even spent hours helping Lee with the beading, telling everyone how beautiful her sister would look. "I don't want her to get married," was all Malia would say, over and over. I spent the morning trying to salvage something for Lee, but the dress was destroyed beyond repair. Lee's fiancé Wade came by that afternoon with a replacement dress he'd somehow found, acting like a hero. But something felt off about how quickly he'd produced a wedding dress in the exact right size. That evening, while Lee got ready at the hotel with her bridesmaids, I sat with Malia trying to understand. "Are you sad about Lee moving out?" I asked gently. She shook her head. "Then why, sweetheart?" She looked at her hands and said quietly, "Wade is mean to Lee when you're not there." I asked what she meant, but she just said, "He makes her cry but tells her not to tell anyone." She was only 9, too young to explain properly, but something in her voice made me pay attention. I went through Lee's old room while she was gone, feeling guilty but needing answers. In her journal, the recent entries were different from her usual cheerful writing. "Wade says I'm getting fat before the wedding. And Wade didn't like me having lunch with my coworkers. And Wade thinks my dress makes me look stupid, but I worked so hard on it." The entries went back 6 months, each one showing more control, more criticism, more isolation from friends. I called Lee's best friend Rachel, who wasn't even in the wedding party for reasons Lee had refused to explain to me. "I've been worried about her," Rachel admitted. "Wade doesn't let her hang out with us anymore. He says we're bad influences." She told me about seeing bruises on Lee's wrist last month, but Lee said she'd caught it in her car door. While searching for more information, I found Malia's iPad and saw she'd been recording videos on it. One from last week showed Wade in our kitchen while I was at work. He was telling Lee her dress looked like trash and threatening to humiliate her at the wedding if she wore it. Lee was crying but trying to stand up for herself. "I worked so hard on this," she said. "That's the problem," he replied. "You care more about that stupid dress than me." Malia had been recording from behind the door, and you could hear her little gasp when Wade grabbed Lee's arm. In Malia's room, I found a notebook where she'd been writing. At the bottom, from yesterday, it said, "Lee was crying in the bathroom and said, 'I have to marry him or he'll do something bad. I don't want her to go.'" I searched Wade's name online, and after scrolling through several pages of normal results, I found social media posts from his ex-girlfriend Valerie from 2 years ago. There were vague references to having to get a restraining order and posts about surviving an abusive relationship. One post said, "He isolated me from everyone who could help," with dozens of supportive comments. Another said, "Leaving him was the scariest thing I ever did," before her account went private. Shaking, I tried calling Lee, but her phone went straight to voicemail. Her bridesmaid texted saying they were at the venue, but Lee had left with Wade an hour ago, saying they needed to talk privately before the ceremony. They were supposed to be taking photos by now, but the photographer said they hadn't shown up. I tracked Lee's location, and it showed her at a motel 10 miles away, not moving. I got in my car and started driving, calling her repeatedly. Finally, she answered, crying. "Mom, I'm scared," she whispered. "He says if I don't go through with the wedding and leave with him tonight, he'll post the photos." I asked what photos, but she just cried harder. "He took pictures of me when we were being intimate. He's been blackmailing me for months. I need you," she said. Then the line went dead. I called 911 and gave them the motel address, driving faster than I'd ever driven. When I got there, Wade was already gone, and Lee was with the paramedics. She had bruises on her arms and kept apologizing through tears. "He's been threatening you and Malia for months. He said if I didn't marry him and move across the country, he'd hurt you and share the photos." Malia knew. That's why she ripped the dress. My heart broke, and I hugged her thinking now it would at least be over. However, Lee grabbed my hand and said something that made me shiver. "Wade showed me a picture of his ex-girlfriend Valerie's little brother tonight. He said he'd do the same to Malia if I tried to leave." My hands started shaking because neither of us had any idea where Wade went. All we knew was that Malia was currently home alone. I jumped in my car and started the engine before I even had my seatbelt on, my hands shaking so bad I could barely grip the steering wheel. I called Malia's cell phone while pulling out of the motel parking lot, and it just rang and rang and rang. I tried again, and it went to voicemail. My heart was beating so hard I thought I might throw up right there in the car. I called 911 and told the dispatcher my 9-year-old daughter was home alone, and my ex-boyfriend who just threatened to hurt her might be heading there right now. The dispatcher stayed calm and asked for my address, and I gave it to her while running a red light. She said she was sending a patrol car right now to do a welfare check and asked me to stay on the line. I kept trying to call Malia on my other phone, but she wasn't answering, and I couldn't stop thinking about that photo Wade showed Lee of Valerie's little brother. Wade had said he would do the same thing to Malia, and I didn't even know what that meant, but the look on Lee's face when she told me made it clear it was bad. The dispatcher asked how far away I was, and I said maybe 15 minutes if I kept speeding like this. She told me to drive safely, but I pressed the gas pedal harder anyway. She said the officer was 3 minutes from my house and would call me as soon as he got there. I drove through another red light and someone honked at me, but I didn't care. All I could think about was Malia sitting in her room alone with Wade, maybe already there or on his way. The dispatcher connected me to the responding officer, and I heard him say he was pulling up to my house right now. He said he could see lights on inside and the front door was locked. I heard him knock through the phone and call out that he was police and it was safe to open the door. There was silence for what felt like forever, and I was gripping my phone so hard my hand hurt. Then I heard Malia's small voice through the phone saying she was scared to open the door. The officer told her his name and badge number and asked her to look through the peephole so she could see his uniform. I heard the lock click and the officer said she was opening the door now. He told me Malia was safe inside and unharmed, just really scared. I asked to talk to her, but he said he wanted to do a full check of the house first to make sure everything was secure. He said someone had been walking around outside earlier based on what Malia told him, and he needed to check the yard and all the rooms. I was still 10 minutes away and my hands were shaking on the steering wheel. The officer said he would stay with Malia until I got there and not to worry. I thanked him about 5 times and he said it was no problem and he had kids too. I hung up with him and immediately called my neighbor Don Garner, who lived 3 houses down. Don answered right away and I said there was an emergency, and could he please go wait on my porch until I got home. I told him Malia was safe inside with police, but I needed someone I trusted nearby. Don didn't ask any questions. He just said he would be there in 2 minutes and would keep watch. The relief of knowing Don would be there made it slightly easier to focus on driving without crashing into something. I kept checking my phone to see if Lee had called, but there was nothing. The hospital was probably still checking her over and she didn't know yet that Malia was okay. I ran another red light and turned onto my street going way too fast. I could see the patrol car in my driveway with its lights still flashing and Don standing on my porch looking worried. I parked crooked in the driveway and ran inside without even closing my car door. Malia was sitting on the couch wrapped in a blanket with the officer standing nearby. She jumped up when she saw me and ran over and hugged me so tight I could barely breathe. She was crying into my shirt and I just held her and told her she was safe now. The officer introduced himself as Officer Logan and said he had checked the whole house and yard. He found footprints in the flower bed under Malia's bedroom window, but no signs of forced entry or current danger. He said the footprints looked fresh, probably from within the last hour or 2. He gave me a report number and his card, and said to call 911 immediately if anything else happened or if Wade showed up. I thanked him and he left, telling Don outside that he could head home now too. After the officer pulled away, I sat down on the couch with Malia and just let her cry until she was ready to talk. She told me she heard someone outside her window right around the time Lee and I left for the motel. She said she got scared and hid in her closet with her iPad like we practiced. When she heard my car leave the driveway, she got even more scared and locked herself in the bathroom. She stayed there until she heard the police knocking and calling out. I told her she did exactly the right thing, and I was so proud of her for remembering our family safety plan. She asked where Lee was and if Wade was going to come back. I said Lee was at the hospital getting checked by doctors, and Wade was not allowed to come near us anymore. I pulled out my phone and called Lee at the hospital. She answered on the first ring, and I told her Malia was safe at home with me. Lee started crying so hard she could barely talk. She kept saying it was all her fault for not leaving Wade sooner and she was so sorry. I told her firmly that none of this was her fault, and Wade was the only person responsible for what he did. She asked if Malia was really okay, and I put Malia on the phone so she could hear her sister's voice. They talked for a minute and Malia told Lee she loved her and everything was okay now. I got back on the phone and told Lee I would pack a bag and bring Malia to the hospital so we could all be together. She said that would be good and there was someone there who wanted to help us. I packed an overnight bag with clothes and toothbrushes for both me and Malia, and we got in the car. Malia held my hand the whole drive to the hospital and didn't say much. When we got there, a nurse directed us to Lee's room and we found her sitting up in bed talking to a woman with short brown hair. Lee's face lit up when she saw us, and Malia ran over and hugged her tight. The woman introduced herself as Charity Good and said she was a victim advocate who worked with people in situations like this. She was calm and professional and talked to Lee like a regular person, instead of treating her like she was broken. I could see Lee sitting up straighter as Charity explained her options for protective orders and criminal charges. Charity said there were specific laws about blackmail and threats, and what Wade did was serious. She had paperwork ready and said she would help Lee through every step of the process. Malia sat next to Lee on the bed holding her hand, and Lee whispered sorry over and over. Malia just hugged her and said it was okay now. There was a knock on the door, and a woman in a dark suit came in and introduced herself as Detective Diana Reardon. She was matter-of-fact about everything without being cold or mean. She explained that blackmail with private photos was a serious crime in our state, and combined with the threats against family members, Wade was looking at multiple felony charges. Lee's hands were shaking as she started to give her statement, but Charity sat right next to her, and Detective Reardon was patient and let her take breaks when she needed to. Lee described the 6 months of Wade controlling everything she did, and criticizing her, and keeping her away from her friends. She talked about the photos he took and how he said he would share them if she didn't marry him and move away. She described the threats against me and Malia and how scared she was all the time. Detective Reardon wrote everything down and recorded it on a small device. When Lee was done, Detective Reardon asked about the video evidence on Malia's iPad. I explained that I found the videos but didn't touch them or copy them because I wanted to make sure the evidence would be good for court. Detective Reardon looked impressed and said that was exactly the right thing to do. She said a lot of people accidentally mess up evidence by trying to preserve it the wrong way. She arranged for a forensic specialist named Jackson to come collect the iPad tomorrow and make a proper copy of everything on it. She gave me a receipt for the device and said they would take good care of it. Charity said this was all really good progress and we were doing everything right. She gave us her card and said she would be with Lee for every court date and meeting. I felt like we weren't alone anymore, and there were actually people who knew how to help us through this. A hospital social worker came in about 20 minutes later and talked to Lee about staying overnight for observation because of the bruising and everything that happened. The social worker was kind and didn't make Lee feel like she was being dramatic or weak. She suggested Malia and I could stay in the family room down the hall, so we could all be together instead of going home. Nobody asked us to leave or made us feel like we were taking up space. That validation meant more than I could put into words after spending months watching Lee shrink under Wade's control. I pulled out my phone and texted Don to thank him for watching the house and asked if he could keep an eye on things overnight. He responded within seconds saying he was happy to help and would walk around the yard before bed to make sure everything looked secure. Having a neighbor I could trust made the decision to stay at the hospital easier. Charity sat with me in the hallway while a nurse helped Lee and Malia get settled in the room. She explained the process for emergency protective orders and said we could file first thing in the morning. The paperwork required specific details about the threats and the pattern of abuse, but Charity would help Lee fill everything out. She handed me her business card and said she would be Lee's advocate throughout this entire process, including attending court dates and helping us understand the legal system. She gave me her cell number and said to call anytime, day or night, if we had questions or needed support. For the first time since finding that destroyed wedding dress, I felt like we weren't alone in this nightmare. There were actually people who knew how to help us and wanted to help us and had the resources to make a difference. That night, I barely slept. The family room had a pull-out couch and some chairs, but I spent most of the night sitting up and keeping watch. Every sound in the hallway made me jump. Every footstep past our door made my heart race. Malia curled up next to me on the couch and slept in fits and starts, whimpering in her dreams. Around midnight, I checked on Lee through the window in her door and saw her staring at the ceiling with tears running down her face. She didn't sleep for hours. I could see her chest rising and falling too fast, like she couldn't catch her breath. Finally, around 3 in the morning, exhaustion took over and she passed out. I used the quiet time to write down everything that had happened in the past day. I documented the times and the names and the exact words people said because Detective Reardon told me documentation would be important for the case. My hand cramped from writing, but I kept going. Every detail mattered. In the morning, Detective Reardon called my cell around 7. She said they had been trying to locate Wade, but he hadn't returned to his apartment and didn't show up at his job. His car wasn't in any of the usual places. She asked if Lee knew of any other locations where he might go. I woke Lee up and put the detective on speaker. Lee's voice was hoarse when she said Wade sometimes stayed at his friend's house across town when they had fights. She gave the detective the address. Detective Reardon thanked her and said they were checking multiple leads and had officers watching Wade's apartment and workplace. She reminded us firmly not to try to contact Wade ourselves under any circumstances. If he reached out to us, we should call 911 immediately and not respond to any messages. Charity arrived at the hospital around 9 with a folder full of paperwork for the emergency protective order. She sat with Lee at the small table in her room and helped her fill out each section with specific details about the threats and the blackmail and the pattern of abuse over the past 6 months. Lee had to describe the intimate photos Wade took without her full consent. She had to write down exactly what he said when he threatened to share them. She had to explain how he isolated her from her friends and controlled what she wore and where she went. I watched her hands shake as she wrote, but her jaw was set with determination I hadn't seen in months. She didn't cry. She just wrote down the truth in clear, simple words. When she finished, she signed her name at the bottom of each page firmly. Charity witnessed the signature and put everything in order for filing. The hospital discharged Lee around 11 with a packet of instructions for follow-up care and a referral to a therapist who worked with domestic violence survivors. We decided she would come stay at home with Malia and me instead of going back to her apartment. The thought of her being alone anywhere made my stomach hurt. I helped her into my car and she moved slowly, like everything hurt. Malia climbed in the back seat and immediately grabbed Lee's hand. They didn't say much during the drive home, but Malia just held on tight. That simple gesture of a 9-year-old protecting her big sister made my throat tight. At home, I did a full check of all the doors and windows before I even let the girls come inside. I walked through every room looking in closets and behind doors. Everything was locked and secure. The footprints under Malia's window were still visible in the dirt outside. I took several photos with my phone from different angles. Then I called a security company about installing cameras and better locks on all the doors. The woman who answered said they were booked up for the next week, but when I explained the situation, she put me on hold and came back saying they could mark it as urgent and send someone tomorrow morning. I gave her our address and thanked her probably too many times. Jackson Choi from the police forensics unit showed up around 2 in the afternoon to collect Malia's iPad. He was younger than I expected and had a gentle way of talking that put Malia at ease right away. He knelt down to her level and explained exactly what he would do with the iPad. He showed her the evidence bag and the chain of custody form. He treated her like her contribution really mattered instead of just patting her head and talking over her. Malia relaxed enough to tell him about the other videos she had recorded over the past few weeks. Jackson's eyes widened slightly, but he just nodded and thanked her for being so brave and smart. He told her the videos would help make sure Wade couldn't hurt anyone anymore. After he left, Malia asked me if she did the right thing, and I hugged her so tight and told her she absolutely did. I sat down with both girls at the kitchen table and we talked about what would happen next. I explained there would be court dates and possibly a trial. I told them Wade would likely be arrested soon, but that we needed to be prepared for this to be a long process. Malia asked if Wade would go to jail, and I told her honestly that I didn't know yet. The legal system was complicated. But I promised we were doing everything right to keep everyone safe. Lee stared at her hands and said she was scared of what Wade might do when he found out about the protective order. I reminded her that Detective Reardon and Charity and all these people were on our side now. We weren't facing this alone anymore. Detective Reardon called that afternoon around 4. She said they had located Wade at his friend's house and officers were preparing to bring him in for questioning. She warned us that he would probably be released on bail initially because that's how the system worked. But the protective order would legally prohibit him from contacting Lee or coming anywhere near our home. If he violated it even once, he would be arrested immediately. I felt my stomach drop at the thought of him being free and out there somewhere. But Detective Reardon's calm confidence helped. She said the system had safeguards in place and we had done everything right so far. She would call us after Wade was processed, and we would know more about the charges and the bail conditions. Lee's phone started buzzing on the kitchen table about an hour later. She stared at it as message after message lit up the screen and I could see her hands starting to shake. Wedding guests were asking what happened, where she was, if everything was okay. Some messages were kind and worried. Others felt pushy and nosy. Lee picked up the phone and scrolled through them with tears forming in her eyes. Her face went pale as she read through dozens of notifications from people who had been expecting a wedding today. Charity had warned us this would happen when we met at the hospital. She'd even written out a simple script Lee could send when she felt ready. Something about the wedding being canceled for personal reasons and asking for privacy. But Lee wasn't ready yet. She turned off the phone completely and set it face down on the table. We sat together in the living room with Malia curled up between us watching a movie, and I kept reminding myself we just needed to get through 1 hour at a time. That evening around 7, my phone rang with Rachel's name on the screen. She asked if Lee was okay because she'd heard through mutual friends that the wedding was called off. I looked at Lee and asked quietly if she wanted to talk to Rachel. Lee froze for a long moment, staring at her hands. Then she nodded slowly. I handed her my phone and left the room to give them privacy, taking Malia upstairs to get ready for bed. When I came back down 20 minutes later, Lee was still on the phone, but something had changed in her face. She was crying but also smiling slightly, the first real smile I'd seen in days. She hung up and hugged me tight, saying Rachel was coming over tomorrow morning and she was sorry for everything Wade had done to push her away. Rachel showed up the next morning at 9 with coffee and bagels from the place Lee used to love, before Wade decided he didn't like her eating there. They sat in the backyard talking for over an hour while I cleaned up the kitchen and kept checking on them through the window. When they came back inside, Rachel gave me a long hug and said she had text messages and emails from Wade going back months. They showed his controlling behavior, the way he isolated Lee from her friends, the nasty things he said about people who cared about her. Rachel wanted to give everything to Detective Reardon if it would help build the case. I felt this wave of relief and gratitude for this friend who never stopped caring even when Wade worked so hard to push her away. The security company arrived around noon with a van full of equipment. The technician spent 2 hours installing a video doorbell that would record anyone who came to the front door. He put motion sensor lights on all sides of the house and window alarms on every first-floor window. He showed me how to use the app on my phone to monitor everything in real time. I could get alerts if any sensor was triggered, see live video from the doorbell camera, and even talk through the speaker if someone was at the door. He added Don's number as an emergency contact, so he would get notified if any alarms went off when I wasn't home. Malia watched the whole installation with wide eyes, asking questions about how the sensors worked and what would happen if someone tried to break in. Having these visible safety measures seemed to ease some of her worry. She tested the doorbell camera by going outside and waving at it, then running back in to see herself on my phone screen. Detective Reardon called around 3 that afternoon. Wade had been brought in for questioning, and they were holding him on the blackmail and threat charges while they built the full case. She explained that Lee would need to come to the station tomorrow to give a formal video statement. The video recording would be crucial for the prosecution because it captured her account in her own words, with all the emotion and detail fresh. She recommended bringing Charity for support during the statement. The prosecutor was taking this very seriously, Detective Reardon said, especially given Wade's history with Valerie. I thanked her and promised we would be there in the morning. After hanging up, I opened my laptop and found Valerie's old social media account that I'd looked at days ago. I sent her a careful message explaining who I was, and that Wade had hurt my daughter in ways that sounded very similar to what she'd been through. I told her there was no pressure to respond, and I understood if she wanted to keep her distance from anything involving Wade. But I included Detective Reardon's contact information in case she was willing to share her experience with the police. I didn't expect to hear back, especially not quickly. But Valerie responded within an hour saying she would talk to the detective, and she was so sorry this happened to another family. She said she'd been wondering if Wade would do this again to someone else, and she wanted to help however she could. That night, I lay awake in bed staring at the ceiling and thinking about all the signs I'd missed over the past 6 months. All those times Lee seemed stressed or distant, and I just assumed it was normal wedding planning pressure. The times she canceled plans with me to stay home with Wade. The way she stopped talking about her friends or her job or anything except wedding details. The guilt felt like it was crushing my chest and making it hard to breathe. But then I remembered what Charity had said at the hospital about abusers being skilled at hiding their behavior and isolating their victims. That's what they do, she'd explained. They make it look normal to everyone on the outside while they're breaking someone down in private. I couldn't change the past or go back and see what I'd missed, but I could make sure we did everything right from this point forward to keep my daughters safe and get Wade held responsible for what he'd done. In the morning, Lee and I drove to the police station with Charity meeting us there. Detective Reardon led us to a small room with a camera set up and comfortable chairs. She explained the process gently, telling Lee she could take breaks whenever she needed, and that this video would be kept secure and only used for the legal case. Lee sat in front of the camera with Charity beside her just out of frame. She took a deep breath and started describing everything. The escalating control over who she could see and where she could go. The verbal abuse that started small but got worse and worse. The physical intimidation when he would get in her face or grab her arm. And finally, the blackmail with the intimate photos he'd taken and threatened to share if she didn't marry him and move across the country. Her voice shook, but she didn't break down. She got through the whole statement in one take, her hands gripping the arms of the chair but her voice steady. When it was over, Detective Reardon thanked her for her courage and said this statement would be crucial for the prosecution. Jackson Choi met with us right after in a different room. He had Malia's iPad with him and he'd finished his full analysis of the videos. There were 4 separate recordings documenting Wade's abuse over the past few weeks. The one where he grabbed Lee's arm and threatened to humiliate her at the wedding. Another where he told her she was worthless and no one else would ever want her. A third where he showed her the photos on his phone and said he would send them to everyone she knew if she tried to leave. And a fourth from just 3 days ago, where he told her they were leaving the state right after the wedding, whether she liked it or not. Jackson had already provided copies to the prosecutor and Detective Reardon. He assured us the evidence was solid and would be admissible in court. Lee watched the videos with tears running down her face, seeing her own suffering from the outside for the first time. She kept saying she didn't realize how bad it looked, how scared she sounded, how much power he had over her. We drove home in silence with Lee staring out the window. That afternoon, a woman named Lisa Yoon called my phone. She introduced herself as the prosecutor assigned to Wade's case. She explained they were filing formal charges including extortion, harassment, assault, and violation of privacy laws related to the intimate photos. Wade's bail hearing was scheduled for tomorrow, and while he would likely be released with conditions, the protective order would be strictly enforced. They could require GPS monitoring if the judge agreed it was necessary given the threats against Malia. Lisa's voice was confident and thorough as she walked me through what would happen next. She asked detailed questions about the timeline and the evidence. She said she'd reviewed Jackson's forensic report and Lee's video statement, and she believed they had a very strong case. The way she talked made me feel like this was being taken seriously, that we weren't just another case file to her. She promised to call right after the bail hearing tomorrow to let us know the outcome and the specific conditions of Wade's release. Detective Reardon called the next morning before the bail hearing to tell us Valerie had given her statement the night before. She'd talked for over an hour about Wade's pattern of control, how he isolated her from friends and family, how he threatened her younger brother when she tried to leave. The detective said Valerie described Wade showing up at her brother's school, taking photos, making comments about how accidents happen to kids who don't have proper supervision. Lee sat at the kitchen table listening to me relay the details, and her hands stopped shaking for the first time in days. She looked at me and said she wasn't crazy, that this was real, that Wade had done this before to someone else. The validation seemed to straighten her spine somehow, like knowing she wasn't the first victim made her feel less alone and more determined to make sure there wouldn't be another one after her. We drove to the courthouse for Wade's bail hearing with Charity meeting us in the parking lot. Inside, Lisa Yoon was already at the prosecutor's table organizing her files. Wade sat at the defense table in an orange jumpsuit with his lawyer beside him, and he didn't look at us when we walked in. The judge called the case and Lisa stood up to argue for high bail and strict conditions. She laid out the threats against Malia, the blackmail with intimate photos, the pattern of abuse documented by Valerie's similar experience. She asked for $50,000 bail, GPS monitoring, a 500-foot distance restriction from our home and Lee's workplace, and absolutely no contact with any of us. Wade's lawyer stood up and called it excessive, saying his client had no prior record and strong community ties. The judge looked at the file in front of him, then at Wade, then back at Lisa. He set bail at $50,000 exactly as requested, ordered the GPS ankle monitor, imposed the distance restrictions, and made it clear that any violation would result in immediate revocation. Wade's face went red, but he stayed silent while his lawyer scribbled notes. That afternoon, I was making lunch when my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. The GPS monitoring company was calling to confirm Wade had posted bail through his parents, and they'd just finished installing his ankle monitor. The representative explained we'd be notified immediately if he violated the distance restrictions or tried to remove the device. She gave me a reference number and a 24-hour hotline to call with any concerns. I thanked her and hung up, then stood in my kitchen feeling the tension creep back into my shoulders knowing Wade was out there somewhere. Detective Reardon called 20 minutes later to check in, making sure we understood the protective order terms, and reminding us to call 911 immediately for any violations. She said patrol officers in our area had been notified about the situation and would increase their presence on our street. Dawn came over that evening to install additional motion sensor lights around the perimeter of the house, And I watched him work while Malia did homework at the kitchen table, and Lee stared at her phone like she expected Wade to call any second. The next day, I drove Lee to her first therapy appointment with Dr. Sarah Logan, who specialized in trauma from domestic violence. I waited in the lobby for an hour reading the same magazine article 3 times without retaining any of it. Lee came out looking exhausted, but somehow lighter, like she'd set down something heavy. On the drive home, she told me it helped to talk to someone who understood that leaving wasn't as simple as just walking away. That doctor. Logan didn't judge her for staying as long as she did, or ask why she didn't tell anyone sooner. The therapist had given her some grounding techniques for when the anxiety got overwhelming, ways to focus on her breathing and bring herself back to the present moment, instead of spiraling into fear. That evening, Lee practiced them with Malia, who thought the breathing exercises were like a game and kept making Lee laugh by adding dramatic sound effects. 2 days later, I met with Malia's school counselor to discuss how she was processing everything. We sat in a small office with cheerful posters on the walls while Malia colored at a side table. The counselor and I created a safety plan for school, including code words Malia could use if she felt scared, and designated safe adults she could go to immediately. Malia admitted she'd been having nightmares about Wade coming to take Lee away, and the counselor gave her some age-appropriate ways to manage those fears, including a special stuffed animal to keep on her bed, and a journal where she could draw her feelings instead of keeping them inside. We agreed to weekly check-ins to monitor how she was doing as the legal process moved forward, and the counselor promised to coordinate with Malia's teacher to watch for any signs of increased anxiety or behavior changes. Jackson called me the following afternoon with an update on the digital forensics. He'd found evidence that Wade had uploaded the intimate photos to a cloud storage account, but there was no indication he'd shared them with anyone else or posted them anywhere public. The prosecutor was using this information as leverage in plea negotiations, making it clear that any distribution would add significant federal charges for revenge porn. Lee was in the room when I put the call on speaker, and I watched relief wash over her face knowing the photos hadn't been shared, followed immediately by fresh anxiety, knowing they still existed somewhere beyond her control. Jackson assured us the cloud account had been seized as evidence and Wade no longer had access to it, but Lee just nodded and went to her room. Rachel came over that weekend to help Lee draft a simple message to send to wedding guests. They sat at the dining room table with Lee's laptop between them, typing and deleting and typing again. The final message explained that the wedding was canceled due to personal safety concerns and asked for privacy during this difficult time. They didn't go into details, but the message was clear enough that most people would understand something serious had happened. Lee hit send and then closed her laptop quickly like she couldn't bear to watch the responses come in. Over the next few days, a few close friends reached out with support, and Lee was surprised by how many people said they'd been worried about her, but didn't know how to help, or felt like Wade had made it impossible to get close to her. 2 weeks after the motel incident, Lee asked if we could go through the remains of her wedding dress together. We spread the torn fabric across her bed and she cried over the destroyed crystals and shredded silk, mourning not just the dress but the future she thought she was building with Wade. I sat beside her and let her cry without trying to fix it or make it better, just being present while she grieved. Then she carefully started removing some of the intact beadwork, small sections where the crystals were still attached to undamaged fabric. She said maybe she could use them for something else someday, something that belonged only to her and had nothing to do with Wade. It felt like a small step toward reclaiming what he'd tried to destroy, taking back something beautiful from the wreckage. Detective Reardon called a few days later to inform us that Wade's GPS monitor had shown him driving past our street 3 times in one evening. He'd technically stayed outside the 500-foot boundary, but was clearly testing the limits of the restriction. She'd already filed a report documenting the behavior, and warned Wade's lawyer that any further boundary testing would result in immediate bail revocation. The prosecutor added this information to their file showing Wade's continued attempts at intimidation, even while wearing the monitor. I increased the security camera monitoring on my phone and made sure all the doors and windows were locked every night, sometimes getting up multiple times to check them again. Charity called Lee the following week about a support group for survivors of domestic violence that met Thursday evenings at a community center downtown. Lee was nervous about going, worried about sharing her story with strangers, or hearing about other people's trauma, but she agreed to try one meeting with Charity accompanying her. She came home 2 hours later and told me it was hard to hear other women's stories, some of them worse than hers, but also comforting to know she wasn't alone in what she'd experienced. One woman in the group had been through a similar blackmail situation with intimate photos and offered to talk to Lee privately about how she got through it and eventually felt safe again. Lee took the woman's number and said she might call her when she was ready. A few days later, Jackson called with his complete forensic report. He'd spent hours going through Wade's laptop and found search history that made my stomach turn. Wade had looked up how to hide money in overseas accounts, how to avoid being tracked when following someone, and how to use private photos to control a partner. Jackson walked me through each finding over the phone, his voice calm and professional as he explained what the search terms meant. The prosecutor could use this to show Wade had planned everything, that it wasn't just anger or a mistake, but careful manipulation. Lisa Yoon called right after Jackson to say this evidence made a favorable plea deal much less likely. Wade's lawyer would have a hard time arguing their client just made bad choices when the laptop showed months of research into control tactics. I thanked Jackson for his thorough work and hung up feeling sick, but also relieved that someone had documented Wade's pattern so clearly. The next morning, Detective Reardon stopped by with a message from Valerie. She'd written saying she was willing to testify if the case went to trial, and she wanted Lee to know she believed her and supported her. Lee read the message twice, her hands shaking slightly as she held the paper. She asked Detective Reardon if she could write back, and the detective said she'd be happy to pass along a response. Lee sat at the kitchen table and wrote for 20 minutes, thanking Valerie for her courage and saying it helped to know she wasn't the only person Wade had hurt this way. There was something powerful about two women who'd survived the same man connecting across time and pain. Detective Reardon took the letter and promised to deliver it that afternoon. Lee and Valerie agreed through their messages to meet in person once the legal stuff was further along, when they could talk face-to-face instead of through written words. 3 weeks passed with court preparation and therapy sessions filling most of our days. Then Lisa Yoon called to say they were ready to offer Wade a plea deal. He could plead guilty to extortion and harassment, accept a permanent restraining order, complete a program for abusers, and serve probation with possible jail time if he broke any rules. Wade's lawyer asked for time to think about it, but Lisa made it clear the offer had a deadline. If Wade refused, they'd go to trial with much more serious charges on the table. She explained this to me first, then asked if Lee was ready to hear the details. I put the phone on speaker, so Lee could listen as Lisa outlined each term of the deal. The restraining order would be permanent, meaning Wade could never contact Lee again for any reason. The program would last 6 months and require him to attend weekly sessions about abuse and control. Probation would be 5 years with regular check-ins and drug testing. Lisa said the alternative was trial, which could result in actual prison time, but would also mean months more of stress and uncertainty. Lee spent the next 2 days thinking about what she wanted. Part of her wanted Wade to face the worst possible punishment, to go to prison and lose years of his life the way he'd tried to take hers, but another part just wanted it over, so she could move forward without him hanging over everything. She had a session with Sarah Logan where they talked through both options. Sarah reminded her there was no wrong choice, that whatever she decided was valid and right for her situation. Lee came home from that appointment looking tired but more settled. Charity stopped by that evening and explained the realistic outcomes of both choices. A plea deal meant certainty and closure within weeks. A trial meant months of preparation, testifying in front of Wade, being cross-examined by his lawyer, and no guarantee of a better outcome. Lee listened carefully and asked questions about what each path would actually look like day to day. A week later, Lisa Yoon called with news that Wade had rejected the plea deal. His lawyer apparently thought they could win at trial or get a better offer if they waited. Lisa's voice was firm as she told us this meant preparing for trial, which could take several months to get on the court calendar. She said she was confident in the strength of the evidence between Jackson's forensic report, the videos from Malia's iPad, and Valerie's willingness to testify. Lee took a deep breath when I told her and said she was ready to testify if that's what it took. I looked at my daughter sitting across from me at the kitchen table, her jaw set with determination, and felt amazed by her courage, even as I wished she didn't have to be this strong. She'd been through so much already, and now had to face months more of legal proceedings, and eventually sitting in a courtroom with Wade present. That same week, Lee decided she needed to look for a new job. Wade knew where she worked, and even though he had the GPS monitor, she didn't feel safe there anymore. Rachel came over that Saturday, and they spent hours updating Lee's resume and practicing interview questions. Rachel had experience with hiring at her company and knew what employers looked for. They worked on how Lee could explain leaving her current job without going into details about Wade. Within 2 weeks, Lee had 3 interviews lined up. One was with a small boutique downtown that specialized in custom alterations and occasional original pieces. Lee's face lit up when she talked about that interview in a way I hadn't seen in months. The owner had looked at photos of the wedding dress Lee had made and been impressed by the detailed beadwork and construction. The boutique called back 3 days later offering Lee the position. Her new boss was a woman named Jenny, who'd run the shop for 15 years and understood when Lee explained she'd need flexibility for court dates during an ongoing legal case. Jenny didn't ask for details and just said they'd work around whatever Lee needed. Lee started the following Monday and came home that first day with fabric samples and stories about the projects she'd be working on. I watched her spread silk and lace across the dining room table, showing Malia different types of stitching and how to match thread colors to fabric. Their laughter filled the house as Malia tried her first attempts at straight seams on scrap material. It was the best sound I'd heard in weeks. Just my daughters enjoying something creative together without fear or tension weighing on them. 2 weeks into Lee's new job, Detective Reardon called with urgent news. Wade had violated his GPS monitoring by removing the ankle bracelet for several hours before putting it back on. The monitoring company had alerted the court immediately when the signal went dead. Wade's lawyer tried to claim it was a technical malfunction, but the bracelet showed clear signs of being cut and then reattached. This was a direct violation of his bail conditions. Lisa Yoon filed a motion to revoke bail that same day, and the judge held a hearing the next morning. I went with Lee to the courthouse and we sat in the gallery while the judge reviewed the evidence. Wade's lawyer argued his client had made a mistake and wouldn't do it again, but the judge wasn't interested in excuses. She revoked bail immediately and ordered Wade taken into custody until trial. He'd remain in jail now, unable to hurt anyone or test boundaries or drive past our street. The relief I felt was so strong it almost knocked me over. Wade was finally somewhere he couldn't watch or wait or plan. With Wade locked up, the constant tension in our house started to ease. Malia slept through the night without nightmares for the first time in weeks. I'd hear her breathing deeply in her room when I checked on her before bed, her face peaceful instead of pinched with worry. Lee stopped checking over her shoulder every time we left the house or jumped at unexpected sounds. We were all still processing everything that had happened, still going to therapy and support groups and dealing with the upcoming trial. But there was space now to breathe and begin actual healing instead of just surviving day to day. We started having normal dinners again, where we talked about work and school instead of court dates and protective orders. Malia brought home a good grade on a math test, and we celebrated with ice cream. Lee showed me a dress she was working on at the boutique with hundreds of tiny pearls sewn by hand. A week after Wade's bail was revoked, Jackson called with his final report about the photos. He'd traced every action Wade had taken with the images, and confirmed that while Wade had uploaded them to cloud storage, he'd never shared them with anyone or posted them anywhere public. The files had just sat in his account as leverage, a threat he held over Lee but never actually carried out. Lisa Yoon planned to use this information when pressuring Wade's lawyer. The evidence showed clear intent to use the photos as blackmail, even though he hadn't followed through with distribution. Lee cried when I told her, relief and leftover fear mixing together. She knew the photos still existed somewhere in a police evidence file, that they'd be part of the court record even if Wade hadn't shared them. But knowing he hadn't sent them to anyone or posted them online lifted a weight she'd been carrying for months. She called Valerie that evening and they talked for over an hour about their experiences and how they were both moving forward despite what Wade had done to them. 2 months passed with Wade locked up, and we built routines that started to feel almost normal again. Lee left for the boutique each morning with her lunch packed, coming home with stories about brides who cried when they saw their altered dresses, and difficult mothers who wanted everything changed at the last minute. She worked with silk and lace and delicate beading, her hands steady and sure as she created beautiful things for other people's happy days. Malia sat at the kitchen table after school doing math homework and spelling tests, talking about her friends and the science project on volcanoes she was building with her partner. I went back to my job with my boss's understanding that court dates might pull me away sometimes, and I fell into the rhythm of meetings and deadlines and normal workplace problems that felt manageable compared to what we'd survived. We weren't the same people we were before Wade, but we were finding our way forward one day at a time. Lisa Yoon called on a Tuesday evening to say the trial date was set for 6 weeks out, and she wanted to meet with Lee to prepare her testimony. They sat together in Lisa's office the following week, going through the direct examination questions, and then practicing the cross-examination, where Lisa pretended to be Wade's defense attorney, asking difficult questions designed to shake Lee's story. Lee's hands trembled when Lisa pushed her on timeline details and asked why she didn't leave sooner, but she answered each question clearly and honestly. After 2 hours of practice, Lee told me the preparation was hard but valuable, that knowing what to expect made the actual trial feel less scary. Lisa explained that Charity would sit in the courtroom gallery where Lee could see her, and I would be there too, along with Rachel and anyone else who wanted to show support. The preparation gave Lee a sense of control she hadn't felt in months, like she was taking back her own story instead of letting Wade's lawyer twist it into something else. A week later, Valerie reached out to Lee directly for the first time, asking if they could meet for coffee. Charity came along as a buffer, sitting at a nearby table while Lee and Valerie talked for over 2 hours about their experiences with Wade. They found painful similarities in how he'd isolated them from friends, criticized their appearance, and used threats to keep them trapped. But they also discovered their own unique strengths, the different ways they'd survived and eventually escaped. Valerie described the restraining order process, and how terrified she'd been to testify against Wade, but also how empowering it felt to speak the truth in court, where he couldn't interrupt or intimidate her. She promised to be there in the courtroom when Lee testified, a friendly face in the gallery to remind her she wasn't alone. They exchanged phone numbers before leaving, agreeing to stay in touch after the trial ended, their connection built on shared trauma, but growing into something more like real friendship. Malia worked with her school counselor to write a letter to the judge explaining why she'd cut up Lee's dress, putting her 9-year-old feelings into simple, honest words. She described hearing Wade make Lee cry through the bathroom door and being scared that her sister would marry someone mean and move far away. The letter talked about wanting to protect Lee even though she was just a kid, about knowing something was wrong even when the adults didn't see it yet. Lisa Yoon read the letter and said it provided important context about Wade's impact on the whole family, showing how his abuse rippled out to hurt everyone who loved Lee. Malia felt proud that she could help with the case, that her protective instinct was recognized as valid and brave instead of punished as destructive. The school counselor made a copy for Malia to keep, and she put it in her special box of important things alongside photos and awards and treasured notes from Lee. 3 weeks before the trial, Wade's lawyer contacted Lisa Yoon with a new plea offer that changed everything. Wade was willing to plead guilty to all charges including extortion, harassment, assault, and violating the protective order in exchange for a recommendation of probation instead of jail time, plus a permanent restraining order and mandatory completion of a batterer's intervention program. Lisa met with Lee to present the offer, making it very clear that the decision was entirely Lee's, and there was no wrong answer either way. Lee asked for 2 days to think about it, and she spent that time talking to Dr. Logan about what she needed for closure, to Charity about the realistic outcomes of trial versus plea deal, to Valerie about her own experience with the court system, and to me about her fears and hopes for the future. She made lists of pros and cons. She cried. She got angry. and she slowly worked her way toward a decision that felt right for her specific situation and healing journey. On the second evening, Lee came to find me in the kitchen and told me she'd decided to accept the plea deal. She explained that she didn't need Wade to go to jail to know that what he did was wrong and criminal and his fault, not hers. The permanent restraining order and mandatory counseling felt like enough protection, and avoiding trial meant she wouldn't have to be cross-examined by Wade's lawyer about the most painful and private parts of her experience. She was ready to move forward with her life instead of spending months more focused on Wade and the trial and reliving the trauma over and over. I hugged her tight and told her I was proud of her for choosing what was right for her, rather than what anyone else thought she should do, and I called Lisa Yoon to let her know Lee's decision. Lisa said she'd inform Wade's lawyer and schedule the plea hearing, and she reminded us that Lee could still read a victim impact statement at sentencing, even though there wouldn't be a trial. 2 weeks later, we sat in the courthouse gallery while Wade stood before the judge at the defense table. His voice was flat and emotionless as he admitted to extorting Lee with intimate photos, harassing her and her family with threats and surveillance, and violating the protective order multiple times by driving past our house and removing his ankle monitor. The judge asked him specific questions about each charge, making sure he understood what he was pleading guilty to, and that he was doing so voluntarily. Wade answered yes to every question, his eyes fixed on the floor, never once looking toward where Lee sat holding Rachel's hand. The judge accepted the plea and scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later, warning Wade that any violation of the restraining order before then would result in immediate jail time and the plea deal being thrown out. We walked out of the courthouse into bright sunshine, and Lee took her first deep breath in what felt like months. In the 2 weeks before sentencing, Lee worked with Dr. Logan to write her victim impact statement, pouring out the 6 months of escalating control, the fear for her family's safety, and the ongoing anxiety about the intimate photos Wade had taken and used against her. But she also wrote about her own strength, about Malia's protective instinct, and Rachel's loyal friendship, and my determination to help her escape. She described her support system and her work at the boutique, and her plans for a future free from Wade's manipulation and abuse. When she practiced reading the statement to me, I cried at both the pain in her words and the power, the way she'd taken back her own narrative and refused to let Wade's actions define her forever. Dr. Logan helped her prepare for the emotional impact of reading it in court with Wade sitting just feet away, and Lee practiced staying grounded and focused on her own truth. The sentencing hearing filled the courtroom with people who loved Lee and wanted Wade to face consequences. Lee stood at the podium and read her statement in a clear, strong voice, while Wade sat at the defense table staring at his hands like he couldn't bear to look at her. Valerie was in the gallery nodding encouragingly whenever Lee's voice wavered, and Rachel squeezed my hand when Lee described the blackmail and threats. The judge listened carefully, taking notes, and then he sentenced Wade to 5 years of probation, 200 hours of community service, mandatory completion of a batterer's intervention program, and a permanent restraining order that would last the rest of Wade's life. He also ordered Wade to pay for all of Lee's therapy costs, and to have absolutely no contact with her, me, or Malia ever again, warning that any violation would result in 3 years in prison. Walking out of the courthouse after sentencing, Lee stopped on the steps and took a deep breath of fresh air, tilting her face toward the sun. Rachel hugged her tight and Valerie squeezed her hand, and Charity reminded her that the hard part was done, and now she got to focus on healing and rebuilding and creating the life she deserved. We went out for lunch together at a little cafe downtown. All of us crowded around a table, and for the first time in months, we laughed about something silly that had nothing to do with Wade or court dates or fear. The conversation flowed naturally between work stories and weekend plans, and a funny video Malia wanted to show everyone on her phone, and it felt like maybe we were finally moving past survival mode into something that looked like actual living. A week after the sentencing, Lee pulled out her sketchbook and started drawing dress designs again for the first time since everything happened. She wasn't designing wedding dresses or anything for clients, just playing with ideas that made her happy. I watched her at the kitchen table one evening, pencil moving across the page, creating something with flowing lines and delicate details that looked nothing like the dress Wade had criticized. She went to her old room and came back with a small box containing the beadwork she'd salvaged from the destroyed wedding dress, crystals she'd spent hours attaching by hand before Malia cut it apart. She held them up to the light and studied how they caught the glow from the kitchen fixture. Then she started sketching a new pattern, something that would use these same crystals, but in a design that belonged only to her, not tied to any wedding or any man's approval. The dress she designed had an asymmetrical neckline and a flowing skirt with beading that spiraled down one side like water. She worked on it most evenings after dinner, sitting at the table with her fabric and thread while Malia did homework beside her. They didn't talk much during these sessions, just sat together in comfortable quiet, Malia occasionally looking up to watch her sister's hands move. I made tea and brought them snacks and felt something settle in my chest watching them heal together like this. Lee would hold up a piece of beading for Malia to see, and Malia would nod seriously like she was judging fine art. The dress took shape slowly over several weeks, and I could see Lee's confidence returning with each stitch, each crystal she attached exactly where she wanted it. Malia slept through the night without waking up scared for the first time about 3 weeks after sentencing. I checked on her in the morning expecting to find her tired and anxious, but instead she was already awake and reading a book in bed, looking peaceful. Her school counselor called me that afternoon to say Malia was doing really well in their weekly sessions, showing what she called remarkable strength for a 9-year-old who went through something so frightening. We decided to keep the weekly check-ins going anyway, because Malia seemed to like having that space to talk about whatever was on her mind. One evening while we were making dinner together, Malia said out of nowhere that she was glad she ripped Lee's dress. I stopped chopping vegetables and looked at her, and she explained that if she hadn't done it, Lee would have married Wade and moved away, and maybe gotten hurt worse. I knelt down next to her and told her she was incredibly brave and smart, that she protected her sister when it mattered most. She asked if I was mad about the dress, and I said no. That dress was just fabric and thread, but Lee was family, and family was more important than anything. Malia hugged me tight and then went back to stirring the pasta sauce like the conversation hadn't been a big deal, but I could see her shoulders were more relaxed than they'd been in months. 3 months after the sentencing, Lee came home from the boutique with news that made her voice shake with excitement. Her boss had seen the dress she was making for herself and asked if she'd be interested in designing a small collection of custom pieces for the shop. Lee was nervous about it, worried she wasn't ready or good enough, but I could see the spark in her eyes that had been missing for so long. She threw herself into the work with energy I hadn't seen since before she met Wade. She designed 6 pieces for her first collection, all evening wear with detailed beading that showed off her skills. She worked late into the nights, sometimes falling asleep at the kitchen table with fabric in her hands. Rachel came over to help with some of the simpler stitching, and they laughed together over coffee while they worked. When the pieces were finished and ready to display, the boutique owner put them in the front window with a small sign that said, "Designed by Lee." We went to see them on a Saturday morning, the 3 of us standing on the sidewalk looking at the window display. Lee stood between Rachel and me with the biggest smile on her face, practically glowing with pride at what she'd created. People walking by stopped to look at the dresses, and one woman even came into the shop to ask about prices while we were standing there. Lee squeezed my hand so hard it hurt, but I didn't care because I was just happy to see her happy again. Valerie and Lee started meeting for coffee every couple of weeks, their friendship growing into something beyond just shared trauma. They talked about work and hobbies and the books they were reading, building a relationship based on who they were now instead of just what Wade had done to them. Lee came home from these coffee dates looking lighter, more like herself. Valerie told her about the healthy relationship she was in now, how different it felt to be with someone who respected her boundaries and supported her goals. She said it was possible to trust again, that not everyone would hurt her the way Wade did. Lee wasn't ready to think about dating yet, but she listened carefully and asked questions about what healthy relationships actually looked like. She told me after one coffee date that talking to Valerie made her realize she deserved better than what Wade gave her, that his treatment wasn't normal or acceptable. Valerie had been through therapy and healing for 2 years since leaving Wade, and she shared what worked for her without pushing Lee to move faster than she was ready. They made plans to go to a craft fair together next month, just 2 friends enjoying a normal activity that had nothing to do with court dates or protective orders. 6 months after everything started, we planned a small celebration at home to mark Lee's first collection selling out completely at the boutique. Rachel showed up with a bottle of champagne and a card signed by all of Lee's coworkers. Dawn came over from next door with a huge bouquet of flowers and a proud smile. Even Charity and Detective Reardon stopped by for a little while, bringing cupcakes from a bakery downtown. We crowded into the living room, all of us talking and laughing, and it felt amazing to celebrate something happy, instead of just surviving something terrible. Malia insisted on making a toast even though she was only drinking apple juice. She stood on the coffee table and raised her cup and said she was proud of her sister for being so brave and making such beautiful dresses. Lee started crying happy tears, and pulled Malia into a hug so tight I thought she might never let go. Lee said she couldn't have done any of this without her little protector, and Malia beamed like she'd won an award. We ate too much food and stayed up too late, and nobody talked about Wade or trials or anything scary. It was just people who cared about each other celebrating how far we'd all come. A week after the celebration, a bride came into the boutique asking specifically for Lee. She'd seen the evening wear collection in the window and wanted to know if Lee could design a custom wedding dress. Lee told me about it that night, and I could see her hesitate, see the old fear come back for just a second. But then she took a deep breath and said yes, she could do it. She met with the bride several times to talk about what she wanted, and Lee designed something beautiful with hand-sewn crystals and delicate beading that took weeks to complete. She worked on it carefully, pouring all her skill and attention into making it perfect for someone else's happy day. When the bride came to pick it up and tried it on, she cried happy tears and hugged Lee and said it was more beautiful than she'd ever imagined. Lee came home that evening glowing with satisfaction, and she told me it felt good to create joy for someone instead of just surviving pain. She said making that wedding dress helped her take back something Wade had tried to destroy, helped her remember that marriage could be beautiful for other people even if it wasn't for her. We started building new family traditions that had nothing to do with Wade or the trial or any of the darkness we'd been through. Friday nights became movie nights where Malia got to pick the film, and we made popcorn on the stove the old-fashioned way. Sunday mornings, Lee taught Malia more advanced sewing techniques, while I made pancakes, and the kitchen filled with the smell of butter and maple syrup and the sound of their laughter. We took a weekend trip to the beach in late summer and built elaborate sandcastles with moats and towers. Malia and Lee swam in the ocean while I watched from the shore, and nobody mentioned protective orders or court dates or being scared. We were just a family enjoying being together, doing normal things that normal families do. We collected shells and ate ice cream and got sunburned and slept well in the hotel room with the windows open to hear the waves. On the drive home, Malia fell asleep in the back seat, and Lee reached over to hold my hand, and neither of us said anything because we didn't need to. One evening in early fall, I found Malia's old notebook while cleaning her room, the one where she'd written about wanting to protect Lee, about being scared Wade would take her sister away. I sat on her bed holding it and remembered that terrible day when everything started. I called both girls into the room and we sat together on Malia's bed, and I told them how incredibly proud I was of their courage and strength. Malia had saved her sister by destroying a dress, seeing what needed to be done even when she was just 9 years old. Lee had saved herself by finally asking for help, by being brave enough to leave even when Wade made it so scary. Together, we'd all survived something that could have destroyed our family, and we'd come through it stronger and closer than before. We weren't the same people we were 6 months ago, and that was okay, because the people we were becoming were braver and more honest with each other. We were building lives filled with safety and creativity and love, lives where we looked out for each other and spoke up when something was wrong. The worst thing my daughter ever told me, that Wade was mean to Lee, turned out to be the truth that saved us all.